Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating, highly debated, and honestly, deeply impactful area of psychology, the mechanics of intelligence testing. We're going to unravel how standardized tests actually work behind the scenes and explore some incredibly provocative historical attempts to expose cultural bias. Let's just jump right in, because how we define and measure smart has profound implications for every single one of us. To really set the stakes here, let's look at a landmark California trial regarding public schools, Larry P. v. Wilson Riles. The judge in this case made a comment that, well, it sounds a bit abrasive at first, but it is deeply insightful. He said the issue was really one of ignorance versus stupidity. You see, both sides agreed that minority students were performing more poorly on these standardized tests, but the big question was, why? Either these students are fundamentally less intelligent, which is that deeply harmful stupidity explanation, or they're simply ignorant of the specific white middle-class cultural norms the test just happens to be asking about. I mean, think about it. If it's just ignorance of a particular culture, well, that can be changed. But if society accepts the stupidity explanation, we literally write off the potential of millions of kids.
15. For decades, the most controversial problem in testing history was the sheer statistical weight of this number. On average, Black Americans historically scored 15 points, that's one full standard deviation, lower than white Americans on standardized IQ tests. Nobody disagreed that this gap existed, but a massive, fiery dispute erupted over the why. Does this test measure innate biological capacity, or does it just measure what kind of neighborhood you happen to grow up in? And that brings us to a really crucial concept: cultural loading. A lot of researchers began to argue that IQ tests are heavily affected by the language skills and knowledge you pick up in a white middle-class upbringing. For instance, a traditional test might assume a kid knows what petrol or a shilling is, which is perfectly normal if you're British, right? But it's utterly foreign to an inner-city American kid. To highlight just how absurd this can get, researchers actually started designing alternative assessments. Adrian Dove created the Chitling test to show that white middle-class folks are completely ignorant of ghetto culture. Later on, another situation looked at the phrase lawyer dog, where a Black man tells a police officer, "Get me a lawyer dog." White children taking the test literally thought the man was asking for a dog that practiced law. Meanwhile, Black children recognized the slang immediately. It brilliantly illustrates how much of what we call intelligence might actually just be vocabulary. Section 1, the BT100 reveal, flipping the script on standardized testing. So to see how this cultural loading builds into an actual real-world scientific challenge, enter Dr. Robert Williams. In 1972, he explicitly subverted the whole testing norm by creating the Bitch 100. This was a test relying entirely on Black cultural knowledge and ebonics, and when he administered it to 16 to 18-year-olds, the results were a dramatic statistical reversal. Black students vastly outperformed their white peers, scoring an average of 87 out of 100. And the white students, they averaged just 51. By simply changing the cultural context of the questions, the entire definition of who appeared intelligent completely flipped. Now, the crucial point Williams was making here wasn't just to play a trick on the establishment. His argument was profound. Traditional IQ tests are not culture-free measures of raw cognitive ability. They just aren't. They are culture-specific tests that assess how much a kid knows about dominant white culture. If Black children perform similarly on traditional tests to how white children perform on the Bitch 10, it basically confirms that being unfamiliar with a cultural context severely penalizes the person taking the test. It's like testing a cat on how well it survives in a rat's environment. It just doesn't make sense.
Section 2, systemic adjustments, pursuing fairer scoring models. Okay, so those experimental subversions were fantastic at making a point. But how did the actual testing industry respond? Well, one major systemic attempt was developed by sociologist Jane Mercer. It was called the System of Multicultural Pluralistic Assessment, or SUMPA for short. Mercer's argument was that all cultural groups have the exact same average potential, and that differences in scores only exist because of differences in access to cultural experiences. So she introduced this concept called estimated learning potential. The SUMPA system basically took a standard IQ score and mathematically adjusted it based on a kid's socioeconomic and cultural background. Essentially, it meant only comparing children to others who had the exact same life experiences as them. And the sheer scale of the adjustments SUMPA could make? Staggering. Literally staggering. According to critics, SUMPA could theoretically take a child who scored in the second percentile on a standard test, give them additional IQ points to compensate for an impoverished background, and boost their adjusted score all the way up to the 70th percentile. Now, while advocates saw this as a move toward true fairness, critics were quick to warn that, mathematically speaking, this essentially turns testing into a quota system, artificially inflating scores rather than measuring a child's current capabilities.
But, there were other, perhaps less controversial adjustments made in test design itself. Take a look at this. When you compare the older, traditional WISC-R test with a newer milestone, the Kaufman Assessment Battery for Children, or KABC, the data totally shifts. On the older test, the Black mean score was 86.4, but on the KABC, it jumps up to 95.0. That drastically narrows the gap. How did they do it? Well, the KABC purposely reduced those culturally loaded knowledge questions we talked about earlier and focused heavily on sequential processing, which is basically just how the brain processes information in steps. By measuring processing power rather than acculturation, the racial gap shrank significantly, all while maintaining predictive validity for how a kid would actually perform in school. Section 3. The Ethics of Selection, Meritocracy versus Diversity. Now we have to zoom out from the tests themselves to the ultimate societal dilemma, because at the end of the day, test scores are used to make massive life decisions, right? So how do we ethically select people for universities and jobs? Psychologists and employment lawyers generally debate three primary ethical models of selection. And I want to be clear here, there is no single correct scientific answer. As the source material points out, these are moral and philosophical choices about what fairness actually means. Let's walk through them. Think of this as kind of a choose-your-own-ethics scenario. Step 1 is unqualified individualism. This approach is completely color and gender blind. You simply take the absolute highest scores on the test, period, regardless of their background. Step 2 is the exact opposite, quotas. This means if a community is, say, 42% Black, then 42% of the people hired for a job must be Black, regardless of how the test scores fall. Then there's Step 3, the compromise, qualified individualism. This model seeks the most qualified people, sure, but it allows administrators to take race or background into account to adjust for known societal discrimination, giving a slight edge to underrepresented groups. So society is constantly in this tug of war between merit-based selection and quota-based selection. If you prioritize pure merit, you run the risk of perpetuating historical inequity, since dominant groups have had way more access to the culture the test actually measures. But if you enforce strict quotas, you can run into a whole other set of problems. The source material gives this really fascinating example about selecting telephone operators. A test found that women were naturally better at the job, and based on scores, selected 70% women. But if a strict 50-50 gender quota was enforced, the company would literally have to bypass highly qualified women to hire lower-scoring men. That could result in a higher failure rate on the job, and it opens the door to messy reverse discrimination lawsuits. All of this tension constantly forces us to step back and ask one incredibly difficult question. How should a fair society balance the reward of individual merit with the moral imperative to correct historical inequity? As we've seen through things like the Beach 100, the SAMPA system, and the KABC, the tests we used are really only as objective as the people designing them. Who gets to define intelligence? And once it's defined, how do we use it fairly? The right answer depends entirely on your own philosophical definition of fairness. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a completely new perspective for the next time you see a standardized test.